I want to establish that first, because everything else I am about to tell you is going to sound like the kind of story a person invents to explain a breakdown. And I need you to understand that the money was real. It was not a breakdown, and I did not invent it. The money was real. I have the bank statements. 3 consecutive deposits, each for $450, made the morning after each shift I completed. Clean transfers from a registered private medical foundation with a listed address in the financial district and a functioning website that described its mission as long-term patient care and facility management. Everything about the job was documented. Everything about it was legitimate. And yet here I am, 11 months later, still sleeping with the light on, still checking, before I get into bed each night, that the bedroom door is fully open, that there is no handle I could accidentally reach in the dark. I accepted the job in October. My mother had died in September, 41 days before the listing appeared in my email, in a newsletter I did not remember subscribing to, from a staffing agency I had never heard of. She had been sick for 2 years. Not dramatically sick, not the kind of sick that comes quickly and announces itself with clarity. The long kind. The kind that installs itself in a person gradually, taking things from them in an order that seems almost considered. Her balance first, then her words, then her ability to recognize me on days when the light was wrong or I had not shaved recently. The kind of sick that costs money in a very specific way. Not all at once, which would at least be clean, but incrementally in co-payments and prescription adjustments and the particular expense of a home care aide for 20 hours a week because you cannot afford the full 40, but you also cannot be there yourself because you have a job or had a job before you stopped going in, consistently enough for them to be able to justify keeping you. I was behind on rent. I had a credit card balance that I was making minimum payments on, which meant I was essentially paying interest on grief. I had not bought groceries beyond the absolute minimum in 6 weeks. I had been applying for positions that I was overqualified for and not hearing back, which is a particular species of humiliation that I do not recommend. The email arrived on a Wednesday evening. The subject line read, "Overnight facility monitoring position, immediate start, above market rate." I read it the way I had been reading everything that month, with the low, flat attention of someone whose interior life had recently been evacuated and not yet refilled. The listing was sparse. A private medical facility in the eastern quarter of the city. Overnight hours 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The role was described as presence monitoring, a phrase that appeared twice in the listing and was not further defined. The compensation was listed clearly, $450 per completed shift, with an initial engagement of 3 shifts subject to renewal. I did the arithmetic. 3 shifts was $1,350. That was 2 months of minimum payments on the credit card. That was the overdue portion of my rent. I sent my resume before I had finished reading the full listing. The interview was held at a coffee shop, not at the hospital. The man who met me introduced himself as Mr. Aldrich Voss, facilities coordinator for the Beaumont Medical Foundation. He was perhaps 60, with the kind of immaculate presentation that reads not as vanity but as professional habit. A very good gray suit, a very clean watch, and a manner that was warm in exactly the precise, calibrated way of someone who has had extensive practice being warm without becoming familiar. He ordered nothing. I ordered a coffee I did not drink. He asked me 4 questions. Whether I was comfortable working alone for extended periods. Whether I had any history of sleepwalking or sleep disorder, whether I had any immediate family members who were current patients at any hospital or care facility, and finally, whether I understood that the role required strict adherence to procedural guidelines, and whether I considered myself the kind of person who followed instructions carefully. I answered yes to the first, no to the second and third. My mother was no longer a patient anywhere, and yes to the fourth. He nodded at each answer with the same degree of attention, as if he were confirming boxes on an internal checklist. He then explained the position. I would be seated in a chair in a restricted corridor of the hospital's older wing, what he referred to as the Harlan wing, for the duration of each shift. The corridor was not in active patient use. My responsibility was to remain present in a specific location outside a specific door and to follow a short list of procedural guidelines that the hospital had developed for the position. "What is in the room?" I asked. "Medical equipment and records from the facility's earlier period of operation," he said. "The room is sealed for preservation and liability reasons. It is not actively used, and you need someone to sit outside it overnight because—" He smiled with the patience of a man who had anticipated this question and had prepared an answer that was technically accurate. "The hospital's insurance carrier requires documented overnight monitoring of certain legacy storage areas. It is a policy compliance issue. The position has historically been filled by contracted overnight security staff, but we have found that a dedicated, non-uniformed monitor is more consistent with the clinical environment of the wing." He paused. "It is, in practical terms, a quiet job. Most of our previous monitors found it very manageable." I noted but did not remark on the fact that he said previous monitors in a way that implied turnover. He produced a single folded sheet of paper from his jacket pocket and set it on the table between us. "These are the procedural guidelines for the position," he said. "Please read them before your first shift. Any questions can be directed to the night charge nurse, whose contact information is at the bottom of the sheet." I took the paper. "Most people find the guidelines self-explanatory," he said, and smiled again with that same precise warmth. "The main thing we ask is that you take them seriously. The hospital has a responsibility to maintain a certain standard of environmental control in the Harlan Wing, and the guidelines exist to support that. They are not suggestions." I looked at him. "I understand," I said. "Excellent." He stood, extended his hand, and shook mine with the brief, firm confidence of someone closing a transaction. "Your first shift begins this Friday at 10 p.m. Please report to the main reception, ask for the Harlan Wing, and someone will escort you. Bring nothing you are not comfortable leaving behind." I opened my mouth to ask what that meant. He was already on his way to the door. 3. I read the guidelines at home that evening, at my kitchen table, with the overhead light on, because I had developed, since my mother's death, a slight but persistent discomfort with dim rooms that I had not bothered to examine too carefully. The sheet was printed on hospital letterhead, the Beaumont Medical Foundation, with a small logo that showed a stylized lamp above a horizontal line, which I assumed was a design element and did not think about again until much later. The guidelines were numbered. There were 7 of them. Harlan Wing, Corridor 7 monitoring guidelines for use by contracted monitoring staff. To be reviewed before first shift. Retain for duration of engagement. 1. Your post is the chair positioned outside Room 7G in Corridor 7 of the Harlan Wing. You are not to leave this chair for periods longer than 10 minutes at any time during your shift, excepting scheduled breaks at 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., 15 minutes each. 2. If you hear sounds from within Room 7G, voices, movement, or percussion of any kind, you are not to acknowledge them verbally or physically. Do not speak toward the door. Do not touch the door. Log the time of the occurrence in the shift log and continue your monitoring. 3. If the door handle of Room 7G moves, direct your gaze downward toward the floor until movement stops. Do not observe the handle during movement. This is a structural characteristic of the room's pressure equilibration system and does not require action. 4. If a member of the hospital staff, including nursing staff, medical staff, security staff, or administrative staff, approaches your post and asks whether the room is occupied, the correct response is no. Do not elaborate. Do not qualify this answer. 5. If the corridor lighting changes color or intensity, remain seated. Do not leave the corridor. If the lighting change persists for more than 10 minutes, you may move to the end of the corridor nearest the stairwell, but do not leave Corridor 7. 6. If anyone, patient, visitor, staff, or any other individual, requests access to Room 7G, you are to deny this request regardless of the stated reason. You are not required to explain the denial. "This corridor is closed" is a sufficient response. 7. If the door of Room 7G opens at any point during your shift is concluded regardless of the time. Collect your log sheet and proceed immediately to the main reception desk. Do not look back at the door. At the bottom of the sheet, a handwritten note in small, careful script Night charge nurse is Sister Calloway. Extension 4471, available 10 p.m., 6 a.m. She will answer questions that she is in a position to answer. That last phrase, that she is in a position to answer, I read it twice. I decided it was bureaucratic phrasing, the kind of careful language that healthcare organizations use to manage liability and communication flow. I decided this deliberately, the way you decide something when a quieter part of you is suggesting you decide otherwise. I folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket. On Friday evening, I drove to the hospital, IV. The Beaumont Medical Foundation occupied a building that had clearly been constructed in two distinct phases. A modern glass and steel addition attached to an older brick structure that predated it by several decades. The main entrance was the modern section, all clean surfaces and recessed lighting, and the hushed efficiency of a private facility that charged enough to make its common areas feel aspirational. The receptionist at the front desk was expecting me. She made a phone call, spoke briefly, and within 3 minutes a porter appeared. A young man who introduced himself as nothing and guided me through a corridor into an elevator and through 2 sets of badge access doors without speaking once. The change was gradual but unmistakable. The modern section gave way to the older structure incrementally. The ceiling height dropping slightly, the lighting shifting from lead warm to the older, flatter fluorescence that hospitals used before, and one realized how much it disturbed people. The floor changed from composite tile to older linoleum, the kind with a pattern that had been worn away in the center of the corridor by decades of foot traffic. The smell changed. Antiseptic is antiseptic, but there is a version of it that carries something underneath. A note of something older, more mineral, the way a building carries the smell of everything it has absorbed over its lifetime, regardless of how thoroughly it has been cleaned. We went through a final door, heavy, fire-rated, the kind that swings shut behind you with a sound like a definitive statement, and into Corridor 7. It was a straight corridor, perhaps 50 feet long, with 4 doors on each side and a single door at the far end. The lighting was the older fluorescent type, and 2 of the overhead strips had the barely perceptible flicker that fluorescent lights develop in the years before they fail. The floor was clean. The walls were painted the particular shade of institutional green that had gone out of fashion sometime in the 1980s, and in this corridor had never been replaced. There were no room numbers visible on the doors, except for one. Halfway down the corridor on the left side, a door with a small placard beside it that read, in the same font as a dozen identical placards I had passed in the rest of the hospital, 7G. The chair was positioned beside it, facing the corridor rather than the door. A plastic chair, the kind with a thin seat cushion, institutional gray. Beside it, a small folding table holding a clipboard with a blank shift log form, a pen on a string, and a paper cup. The porter gestured at the chair. "Breaks at 1 and 4, he said. These were the first words he had spoken to me. Kitchen is 2 floors up. Sister Calloway is on the main ward floor if you need anything. Extension 4471. Has anyone told you what I started? Breaks at 1 and 4, he repeated, and left. I listened to his footsteps retreat down the corridor, through the heavy door and into the distance. Then I sat down. I looked at the door. Room 7G had a standard hospital door, wooden core, painted white, with a small wired glass window at approximately head height. The window was covered on the inside with what appeared to be a piece of plain paper, taped to the glass so that no light came through from whatever was on the other side. The handle was a standard lever type, pushed down to open. I looked at the door for a long time. It looked back at me the way doors look back at you when there is nothing to see. Blankly, without content, without drama. I looked at the first line of my guidelines. I opened the shift log and wrote the date and time. Then I sat back in my chair and began the first of what would turn out to be the strangest 8-hour periods of my life. The first of them being the strangest because it was almost entirely normal. Almost V. Sometime around midnight on that first night, I heard a sound from inside room 7G. I want to describe it accurately, because my first instinct was to describe it as something more dramatic than it was. It was not a scream. It was not a voice saying something recognizable. It was a sound that, if I had heard it from a room in an apartment building, I would have categorized as someone shifting in a bed. the soft compression sound of weight redistributing on a mattress, followed by a brief settling. A sound, in short, that required a body to produce. I remembered Guideline 2. I did not speak. I did not touch the door. I wrote the time in the shift log, 12:17 a.m., and the notation interior sound, settling quality, duration approx. 3 seconds, I put the pen down. The corridor was silent again. I sat with that for a moment, Mr. Voss had told me the room was sealed medical equipment and records. Medical equipment and sealed records do not shift weight. I looked at the paper taped over the interior window. In the dim corridor light, I could not tell whether there was any illumination on the other side of the glass. The paper was thorough. No light seeped through. At approximately 12:45 a.m., a woman appeared at the far end of the corridor. She moved at the measured pace of someone who was very practiced at maintaining composure as a professional habit. A nurse, clearly, in the dark uniform of the night shift, her hair pulled back, her expression arranged in the carefully neutral way that I would come to recognize as the Beaumont night staff's default register. She stopped when she saw me. Not startled, she clearly knew I was there. Something more like a pause of assessment. The way you look at a thing to confirm it is where it is supposed to be. "You're the new monitor," she said. Not a question. "Yes," I said. "I'm Sister Calloway." She did not approach the chair. She remained at the corridor end, roughly 20 feet away. "You have my number if you need anything." I paused. "Can I ask you something?" She waited. "The room," I said. "Voss told me it was medical equipment and records. But I heard something inside it a while ago that sounded like—" "Old buildings make sounds," she said. Her voice was even, not dismissive, careful. "The wing dates to 1961. The pressure system in particular creates sounds that carry through the walls in unusual ways. It's documented." She was looking at me with an expression I could not quite categorize. Not unfriendly, not dishonest, exactly. More like the expression of someone who is telling you the version of the truth they are permitted to tell, and who knows that you are smart enough to understand the distinction. "If anything concerns you," she said, "call me. That's why I'm listed." She left. I sat with the silence for a moment. Old buildings make sounds, pressure systems, documented. I thought about how specifically Guideline 2 addressed interior sounds. You do not write specific guidelines about pressure systems. I wrote 1:48 a.m., staff contact, Calloway RN in my log, and said nothing else to anyone for the rest of the shift. At 6 a.m., a different porter appeared, collected my log sheet, and escorted me back through the 2 badge access doors and the elevator and the corridor and out into the morning, where my car was in the parking structure and the world outside was ordinary and bright and full of the sounds of traffic, and I sat in the driver's seat for a while before starting the engine. The money was in my account by 7:15. I went home and slept without dreaming, which was unusual. I had not gone one night without dreaming about my mother in 6 weeks. That should have told me something. I filed it away instead, VI. The second shift was 3 nights later, a Tuesday. I noticed 3 things that I had not noticed on my first visit. The first was that Corridor 7 did not appear on the hospital floor directory that was posted on the wall beside the elevator. The directory listed floors 1 through 7 with detailed wing breakdowns for each. Harlan Wing was listed on floor 4, corridor 4, with a note that it was accessible to registered clinical staff only. There was no floor 7. There was no corridor 7. I was taken to corridor 7 on an elevator that I had, on my first visit, assumed went from floor 1 to floor 4. On my second visit, I paid closer attention. The button the porter pressed was labeled with a symbol rather than a number, a small horizontal line with a vertical mark through it, like a stylized letter I. When I asked the porter which floor we were on, he said the Harlan Wing and did not elaborate. The second thing I noticed was the smell. On my first visit, I had registered it as old building antiseptic and moved on. On this second visit, I paid more careful attention, and underneath the antiseptic I identified something I had not been ready to identify the first time. The smell of a room where someone has been sick for a very long time. The particular atmosphere of prolonged human illness. Something organic and close, carried in the recycled air of a space that has contained suffering for longer than its ventilation system can fully clear. I knew that smell very well. I had lived inside it, in my mother's house for the last 8 months of her life. The third thing was the door. On my first visit, I had noted a small placard beside room 7G reading the room number in standard hospital font. On this second visit, there was a second piece of information on the placard that I had not seen before. Below the room number in smaller text, Est, 1961. Do not modify room designation. I sat down. I opened the shift log. I noted the time. At 11:22 p.m., the door handle moved, not dramatically, not with force. It depressed slowly, partially, perhaps a third of its full range of motion, and then held there for approximately 4 seconds, and then returned to its neutral position. I had looked at the floor as Guideline 3 instructed. I had looked at the floor, and I had counted the seconds, and I had kept my breathing steady and even. And when the handle returned to neutral, I looked up and wrote the time and a description in my log. What I want to tell you is that following the guideline was easy, a simple mechanical compliance, a choice to look at linoleum rather than a door handle because a piece of paper had told me to. What I want to tell you is that, in reality, looking at the floor was the hardest physical thing I had done since the morning I dressed my mother for the last time before the home care aide arrived for her shift and found her not breathing. Looking at the floor required the particular muscular effort of a decision being fought by every instinct I had, every automatic response that says, when something moves in your peripheral vision, look at it. That is what eyes are for. I looked at the floor. I counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. The handle stopped. I looked up. The door was unchanged. I wrote in the log. I put the pen down. I became aware that my hands were shaking, not severely, but consistently, with the low, continuous tremor of a system under stress that it is working to conceal. At 12:03 a.m., I called extension 4471. Sister Calloway answered on the second ring. The handle moved, I said. A pause. I know. You know. I receive an alert when it moves. It's part of the monitoring system. Another pause. You followed the guideline? I looked at the floor. Good. The word was brief but carried, somehow, a quality of genuine relief. That's the correct response. Is there anything else? Is there someone inside that room? Silence. Sister Calloway. The room, she said carefully, is classified as unoccupied. That is the hospital's official designation, and it is the answer I'm required to provide you. That's not what I asked. Mister, she paused. I'm going to ask you to trust that the guidelines exist for reasons, not because we can't explain them, because the explanation is not going to be useful to you. Following the guidelines is useful. The explanation is, she stopped. Are you physically all right? Yes, then I'll let you go. Call me again if the handle moves a second time in the same shift. That's when you need to call me. Has it moved twice in a single shift before? She hung up. I sat in the corridor for the remaining 5.5 hours of my shift, and the handle did not move again. And at 2:34, I heard the sound from inside the room a second time. Not the settling sound of the first night, but something different. A sound that I spent a long time afterward trying not to accurately identify. It was the sound of someone breathing, slow and slightly labored, with the characteristic quality of someone who has been breathing with difficulty for long enough that their body has accepted this as its new normal. My mother breathed like that in her last 3 months. I wrote the time in the log. I did not call Sister Calloway. I stared at the opposite wall of the corridor for a long time, and I did not look at the door, and I did not speak. And the breathing continued for approximately 11 minutes and then stopped. At 6 a.m., I handed the log to the porter and walked out. The money appeared in my account at 7:03. I went home and did not sleep at all. 7. I want to tell you about the security guard before I tell you about the third shift. His name was Reyes. I encountered him for the first time on my second shift, around 3 a.m. He passed through Corridor 7 on what appeared to be a standard patrol route, nodded at me without breaking stride, and continued to the far end of the corridor and through the heavy door. 20 minutes later, he came back. This time, he paused. He was a large man, perhaps 50, with the manner of someone who had spent enough years in institutional security work to have developed a very precise calibration of what he was and was not willing to get involved in. He looked at the door. He looked at me. He looked back at the door. First week? He said. Second shift, I said. He nodded slowly. Handle moved tonight, he asked. Once, I said. He absorbed this. You follow the sheet? I looked at the floor. Something in his posture shifted, a very small access of tension that I might not have noticed if I hadn't been sitting in a silent corridor for 5 hours calibrated to notice small details. Good, he said. He looked at the door again, with the particular focused attention of someone who has had a long and considered relationship with a thing, and has arrived at a settled position regarding it. Don't look at it when it moves. Don't look at it when you hear things. Don't look at it when the light changes. The guidelines say the same thing. The guidelines say some of it. He turned back to me. I'm not supposed to tell you anything that contradicts the official briefing. You're not contradicting anything, I said. You're agreeing with it. A slight, humorless expression that might have been the shadow of a smile. There was a monitor here about 2 years back. Woman named Fentress. Good at the job, very calm, very practical. She was on her 4th shift when the handle moved and she stood up and watched it instead of looking at the floor. He paused. She didn't last the night. She quit? She was escorted out at around 2 a.m. I don't know exactly what happened. I know what she looked like when they brought her out of the corridor, and I know she didn't come back, and I know the position was relisted 2 weeks later. He looked at the door once more. Whatever's in that room, it doesn't like being seen trying to get out. But it is trying to get out, I said. He looked at me with the flat attention of someone choosing their words. No, he said. I don't think it's trying to get out. I think it's checking whether it can. He paused. Those are different things. He continued his patrol. I sat with that distinction for the rest of the shift. Between my 2nd and 3rd shifts, I did something I had told myself I was not going to do. I researched the hospital. The Beaumont Medical Foundation was, as represented, a legitimate registered private medical entity with a clean regulatory history and no notable public incidents. Its Harlan wing was referenced in a 1994 journal article on the architectural preservation of mid-century medical facilities as an example of functionally retained historical infrastructure, which was academic language for a section of the hospital that they kept running because it would cost more to decommission it properly than to maintain it. The article mentioned in a footnote that the Harlan wing had originally operated as a specialist ward for patients with complex neurological and psychological presentations requiring extended observations periods. It had been reclassified as a general administrative and storage wing in 1989. I found through a local historical archives digital index a brief reference to the Harlan wing in a 1973 nursing journal, an account of the wing's therapeutic monitoring program, which appeared to involve keeping severely deteriorated patients in individual rooms under continuous observation rather than in wards. The program was described, carefully, as an experimental approach to containing symptomatic progression in cases where treatment had reached its limits. Containing, not treating, not managing, containing. The article was 4 paragraphs long and did not name any specific rooms. I also found, through 30 minutes of searching the city's archived property records, a scanned copy of the hospital's 1961 construction permit, which included a floor plan. The plan showed on what was labeled Level 7, Restricted Clinical, a corridor running east to west with 8 rooms on each side and a single room at the western terminus. The western terminus room was labeled 7G, Long-Term Observation, Single Patient Capacity, Sealed Environmental Controls, Access, Senior Clinical Authority only, Single Patient Capacity. Not storage, not records, single patient capacity. I printed the floor plan. I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket next to the guidelines sheet. Then I drove to the hospital for my 3rd shift, INCS. On the 3rd night, the lights changed. It happened at 1:47 a.m. while I was back from my first break and settled in my chair with the shift log open on the folding table. The fluorescent strips overhead did not flicker or dim. They shifted, smoothly, without the gradual transition you might expect from a failing tube. From the standard flat white-yellow of institutional fluorescence to a blue that was precise and cold, the particular blue of a very clear sky, photographed through a filter that removes everything warm. I looked at my hands. They were blue. Everything in the corridor was blue. The walls, the floor, the door of room 7G, my own hands flat on my thighs. It was not frightening in the visceral sense. It was frightening in the deeper sense. The sense in which something impossible is frightening, not because it threatens you, but because it restructures your understanding of what the world is capable of. Lights do not change color. Not like this. I followed guideline 5. I remained seated. I looked at the corridor around me, blue and still and silent, and I was aware of my own heartbeat in the way you become aware of it when your body is deciding whether to respond physically to something, and you are telling your body, quite firmly, not to. After 6 minutes, the lights returned to normal. 2 minutes after that, I heard something from inside room 7G that I have been trying to find adequate language for ever since. It was a voice, specifically a woman's voice. Specifically. And I am going to state this plainly because hedging it would be dishonest. My mother's voice. Not a mimicry. Not a sound that vaguely resembled her voice in the way that certain sounds vaguely resemble certain things. Her voice, with the specific quality it had in the last year of her life, slightly slower than it had been, slightly more considered in its production, as if each word required a deliberate decision to release. The voice of a woman who had been told her brain was managing its remaining functions carefully. She said my name, just my name once. I looked at the floor. This was not a mechanical compliance. This was the single most difficult thing I have ever done. You must understand that I had not heard my mother's voice in 47 days. That I had, the morning she died, held her hand for 2 hours in the quiet of a room that smelled of the particular atmosphere of prolonged illness. That I had spent 6 weeks in a grief so complete that some mornings I had forgotten, for a single bright second after waking, that she was gone, and then remembered, and felt the knowledge settle back into my body like weight. I looked at the floor. I kept my mouth closed. She said my name again. The same voice. The same quality. And then, and this is the detail I have told no one until now, she said, in the gentle, factual way she had of stating things she wanted me to pay attention to. I know you're there, sweetheart. I can hear you breathing. I kept my eyes on the floor. My face was doing something that I could not fully control. I was not crying. I was somewhere past the capacity for crying, in the place where grief becomes a physical sensation rather than an emotional one, a pressure behind the sternum, a tightening in the throat, a kind of weight that the body carries without being able to set it down. I did not speak. The corridor was silent for a long time. Then, very quietly from inside room 7G, I heard something that was worse than my mother's voice. I heard her laugh, not at me, not mockingly. The small, private laugh she made when she was comfortable, when she was at ease. The laugh that belonged to the version of her that existed before the illness. The version I had been trying to remember clearly for 6 weeks, and finding each time that the illness version was overlaying it, as if I could only see her sick, and the woman she had been before was becoming unreachable. That laugh had not belonged to the last 2 years of her life. Whatever was inside room 7G had found it somewhere. I did not speak. I did not look up. I sat with my hands flat on my thighs and my eyes on the linoleum, and I counted my own breaths until the sound stopped, and then I counted 50 more for good measure. Then I picked up the phone and called 4471. Sister Calloway, I said, I need you to tell me what is in that room. A silence. I heard my mother's voice, I said. My mother died 6 weeks ago. I heard her voice from inside the room. Another silence, longer. Are you still at your post? She asked. Yes, and you didn't speak toward the door. No, I heard her exhale, not quite a sigh. Something more involuntary, the kind of breath that escapes when attention releases slightly. Good, she said. Stay at your post, I'm coming down. X. She arrived 8 minutes later. She did not sit. She stood at the end of the corridor, the same position she had maintained on my first night. And she looked at me with the expression of someone making a decision about how much is useful to say. How much do you know about what this wing was used for before 1989? She asked. I told her about the journal article, about the construction permit, about single patient capacity, and sealed environmental controls and long-term observation. She absorbed this with a nod that said she had expected I would find it. The program ran from 1961 to 1988, she said. It was called the Harlan Protocol. It was developed by a neurologist named Dr. Peter Harlan, which is why the wing carries his name. She paused. He was working with a category of patients who had exhausted every available treatment option. Severe cases, neurological deterioration, dissociative conditions, what they were calling at the time terminal psychological displacement. Patients who had lost, through illness, most of what the hospital classified as functional identity. "What does that mean?" I said. "Functional identity. The capacity to maintain a consistent self," she said. "To know who they were, to know where they were, to know what was real." She looked at the door. Dr. Harlan's position was that these patients weren't losing their minds. They were, his language, becoming porous. The boundaries between themselves and what he called the ambient environment were breaking down. He believed they were absorbing things from the people around them. Memories, emotions, specific sensory details. I was very still. He believed they were also transmitting, she said, broadcasting in a sense. That what they were absorbing they were also reflecting back, amplified, rearranged. That being in proximity to them was, she paused again, disorienting for the staff, for other patients. So he isolated them, I said. He isolated the most advanced cases in individually sealed rooms with specific environmental controls, and he documented what happened. She looked at me directly now. The last patient admitted to room 7G was in 1984. Her name was Ines Marchetti. She was 43 years old. She had been in a state of what Harlan called complete porous transition for approximately 4 years before admission. What does that mean? Complete porous transition? Sister Calloway was quiet for a moment. It means, she said carefully, that she had stopped having her own memories. She had only other people's. She had stopped having her own voice. She had only the voices she had absorbed from the people around her. She paused. She was also, according to the documentation, absorbing grief, specifically. Harlan noted that visitors in states of acute grief were the most severely affected by proximity to her, that she reflected their grief back to them through the specific memories associated with it. The corridor was very quiet. "She's still in there," I said. "The hospital's official position," she said, "is that room 7G is an unoccupied sealed storage room. But she's still in there." Sister Calloway did not answer. 1984 was 40 years ago, I said. A person cannot survive 40 years in a sealed room. No, she agreed. A person cannot. She let that sit. "When did Dr. Harlan die?" I asked. 1991. He was one of the last people to enter room 7G. He went in to conduct what his notes describe as a final assessment in 1988, when the program was being shut down. He was inside for 4 hours. When he came out, he sealed the room and wrote in his final case notes that the patient could not safely transferred or discharged. He wrote that to move her would be to, she hesitated. He wrote that to move her would be to release what she had become into an uncontrolled environment. "And they just left her there," I said. "They contained the situation," she said, "in the way that institutions contain situations they cannot resolve. They maintained the room. They kept the wing operational. They established the monitoring protocol." She looked at me. "The monitoring protocol exists because, according to Harlan's notes, she is aware of being observed, and awareness of being observed appears to be the primary factor in whether she," a pause, "extends beyond the room. She reaches out when no one's watching," I said. "The handle moves more frequently on unmonitored nights," she said. "The documentation is clear. A presence in the corridor significantly reduces handle movement." I thought about Reyes, checking whether it can. "But it's not just the handle," I said. "It uses people's grief. It finds what you've lost in it." "Yes," said Sister Calloway, with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who has known something for a long time and rarely gets to say it aloud. "The last monitor before me," I said. "The one who watched the handle move, Fentress. What happened to her?" Calloway looked at me steadily. She came out of the corridor believing her sister was still alive. Her sister had died 2 years earlier. She remembered conversations with her sister that had happened since her death. She was thoroughly, completely convinced. A pause. "She was still convinced, the last I heard. She's receiving support, but she has not lost the memories. The new memories are intact." I thought about the laugh from inside room 7G. My mother's laugh, the pre-illness version, so vivid and specific and real. If I had spoken, I said. If I had answered when I heard my mother's voice. You would have confirmed contact, she said, and she would have learned you, mapped you, and what she reflected back would have been. She stopped. More complete, I repeated. You would have walked out of this corridor with your mother in your head, she said. Not a grief dream, not a feeling, a presence, a memory that is newer than her death. Something that knows your name and responds to it and sounds exactly like her and will never, from that point forward, be fully distinguishable from the real memories you already have. The corridor hummed with the sound of old fluorescent lighting. Why did they hire me, I said. Why did they specifically recruit someone who had recently? They didn't, Calloway said, and her voice carried something that might have been genuine discomfort. We post the listing. The listing finds the right applicant it always has. She paused. She pulls toward grief. The listing goes out, and people who apply are almost always. She stopped. Voss would tell you it's a coincidence of candidate self-selection. People in financial distress following a bereavement are motivated to respond to above-market rate positions. And what would you tell me? A long pause. I would tell you to finish your third shift, she said. And then I would tell you that whether you come back for a fourth is entirely your choice, and that no one here will judge you if you don't. She left. I sat in the blue-walled silence of Corridor 7 until 6 a.m., and the handle did not move, and I did not hear my mother's voice again. And when the porter came to collect my log sheet, I handed it over and walked out and sat in my car in the parking structure for a long time. At 7:09, the money appeared in my account. I came back for a fourth shift. I want to explain this because I know how it sounds. I know the rational position that I had enough information to make a sensible decision, and the sensible decision was to stop, to take the 3 payments and use them for what I needed and not return to a hospital corridor where a 40-year-old woman who had become something other than person sat in a sealed room and listened for the sound of grief and learned the voices of the dead. But here is the thing about grief. It does not respond to rational positions. Grief has its own logic, its own pull, its own version of gravity. And what I had heard in Corridor 7 on my third shift, my mother's voice, her real voice, the version of it I had been losing to the illness memory, had done something to me that I am still not entirely able to articulate. It had reminded me that she had been a person before the illness, that the person I had been grieving, the diminished, suffering, dying version, was not the full account, that the original was still in me somewhere if I could find it. Room 7G had shown me that it existed. Somewhere, in whatever Ines Marchetti had become in 40 years of accumulation, my mother's laugh existed. Clean, intact. That is the horror I am least able to make sound like horror. Because it does not feel like horror, it feels like the cruelest possible kindness. I came back for the fourth shift. I sat down in the chair at 10 p.m. At 11:15 p.m., someone attempted to open the door, not the handle moving on its own. The particular mechanical, purposeful movement of a hand pressing a lever with the intention of pushing the door open. A full depression of the handle, a resistance at the latch, and then a pressure at the door itself, the sound of a door being pushed against a locked frame. I looked at the floor. The pressure continued. I heard through the door a voice. Not my mother this time. A man's voice, elderly, with the specific quality of someone who is not distressed but is very tired. He said, "They told me this was my room. I've been in this room for 30 years. Would you let me in, please?" I looked at the floor. "I know you're there," the voice said. "I can see your shoes." I looked at the floor. "I'm not asking you to do anything wrong," the voice said. "I'm asking you to let an old man into his own room." I said nothing. The handle returned to neutral. The pressure against the door stopped. I called Calloway. "Someone tried to open the door from the inside," I said. From the inside, with clear intention. And there was a voice, a man's voice, not my mother this time. A pause. "What did he say?" I told her. Another pause longer. "Previous monitor," she said finally. "Not Fentress. Earlier, there was a monitor here about 5 years ago who made contact, responded to something he heard." Her voice was careful. "He left the hospital intact. But he came back. 2 nights later he came back and he stood outside the door and he talked to it for, we estimate, about 40 minutes before the security system flagged the door sensor. By the time Reyes got there, he went in," I said. We found him inside, in the room. He was physically fine. He's still physically fine. He's in a residential facility now. He doesn't know where he is, but he's calm. He describes the room as home. I looked at the floor of the corridor. She doesn't take people, I said. She waits for them to come to her. Yes, because if you come to her, if you open the door yourself, if you make contact yourself, then you've consented. In whatever logic she operates on. That's what Harlan believed, Calloway said quietly. He thought she operated on a consent structure, that every absorption, every extension of herself into someone else, required the other person's participation. However briefly, however unwittingly. Answer when she calls your name, I said. Let go of the handle, step through the door. Yes, I looked at the door of room 7G. The paper was still taped over the wired glass interior window. Still no light from the other side. What would happen, I said, if someone opened the door from the outside and she was able to extend fully? Leave the room, a very long silence. Harlan's final note on that question, Calloway said. Rids. She would carry everything she has absorbed into an open environment. Every grief, every memory, every voice she has learned in 40 years of accumulation. She would distribute them, like a disease carried by a host who doesn't know they're infected. A pause. He believed she didn't want to leave. He believed she was oriented toward the door because she was aware of people on the other side, and awareness of people pulled her toward them. But he believed she was, in her own way, also aware of what leaving would mean. Containing herself, I said, in a manner of speaking. I thought about what Reyes had said. She's not trying to get out. She's checking whether she can. A presence that had been accumulating human memory and grief and the voices of the dead for 40 years. Checking, periodically, patiently, with the measured rhythm of a person taking a breath, whether the door would open. And every 8 hours, someone sat in this chair to be the answer. No, the chair said, not tonight. Someone is watching. Someone is here. The door is closed. Not a guard, not a lock. A witness. 12. I finished my 4th shift. I handed in my log. I walked out. I did not go home. I sat in my car in the parking structure and thought about my mother's laugh. The pre-illness version. Intact and vivid inside a sealed room in a hospital wing that did not appear on modern maps. I thought about the monitor who had gone in and was now calm in a residential facility, somewhere that felt like home in ways his actual home never had. I thought about the consent structure. Every absorption required participation, however briefly, however unwittingly. I thought about Guideline 7. If the door of room 7G opens at any point during your shift is concluded regardless of the time. Not if the door is opened. If it opens, passive construction. As if the agency behind the opening doesn't matter. As if the door opening is simply an event, not an action. I thought about Harlan's phrasing. Releasing what she had become into an uncontrolled environment. I sat in the parking structure until the morning shift began to arrive. And then I drove home and I slept. And for the first time in 7 weeks, I dreamed about my mother. Not the illness, not the decline, not the morning I found her, but the version I had been losing. Dinner table, her handwriting on a birthday card, her laugh when something surprised her into being delighted. I woke up and the dream was still there, clearly and fully, the way dreams usually are not. I do not know whether that was mine, whether it came from inside me, recovered by proximity to something that held it, or whether it was a reflection. A fragment of accumulation drifting through a corridor, through a chair, into a sleeping mind. I do not know. I have thought about this every day since. I have not returned to the hospital. I made this decision not quickly or easily, but with the deliberate consideration of someone who understands that some thresholds once crossed cannot be uncrossed. Whatever is in room 7G has my voice now, my breathing, my name in my mother's voice, the specific frequency of my grief. Whether that is a small thing or a large thing, I cannot fully assess. I know only that I have not returned, and that I sleep with the light on, and that I check each night that my bedroom door is fully open. I have heard from Reyes once since leaving. He contacted me through a method I did not know he had, and he told me in a brief message that the position had been relisted, that a new monitor had started, that the handle had been quiet since I left, which was normal for the first week, with a new presence in the corridor. He also told me that on my final night, The fourth shift, when the voice of the old man pressed against the door and said, "I've been in this room for 30 years. A review of the corridor's audio monitoring had picked up something that had not been audible in real time. Between the old man's sentences, in the silences between, they told me this was my room and I can see your shoes. My mother's breathing, not broadcast into the corridor, private, contained, as if she were there alongside the voice, patient, present, waiting for me to answer. The chair answered instead. I answered instead by not answering. I think about that most nights. Whether that was the right choice. Whether there is a right choice. Whether Harlan was right that she contains herself. That the accumulation of 40 years of grief has also accumulated the understanding of what it costs to release it. I do not have a clean resolution for you. I don't have a moment where everything snapped into focus and I understood perfectly. I have a bank account with some money in it and a recurring dream that may or may not be entirely mine, and a bedroom door I leave open every night. And the specific knowledge that somewhere in the eastern quarter of this city there is a corridor that doesn't appear on any modern map, and a chair, and a door, and something behind it that has been listening for 40 years. And the chair is never empty for long. That is the part that stays with me. Every time a monitor leaves, walks out into the ordinary morning, takes their money, drives home, the listing goes out again, and someone finds it. Someone who is looking for something specific without knowing they are looking for it. Someone who has recently lost something they are not ready to be finished losing. And the listing finds them, and they sit in the chair, and the door stays closed until the next shift, and the one after that, and the one after that. I don't know how long this has been going on. I know that the original construction permit dates to 1961. I know that the first entry in the Harlan Wings monitoring log, the one I found in the lower archive records, filed under a case number rather than a name, is dated March 1967. I know that the final entry Dr. Harlan wrote in Enos Marchetti's case file was dated November 1988, and that the last line reads, "She has become a function. She is not a patient anymore. She is the thing the lighthouse does. The light is what matters. Not what the light is for, not what the dark contains. Only that the light keeps going." I did not understand that when I first read it. I understand it now. The chair is the light. The door stays closed only as long as someone is sitting in it. And somewhere in that room, in 40 years of accumulated grief and borrowed voices, something that used to be a woman named Ines Marchetti is listening. She is very patient. She has been here since 1984. She is not going anywhere. The listing is probably active right now. It will find whoever it finds. I don't know your name, but if you applied for a position described as presence monitoring at an above-market rate for overnight work, and the interview was held at a coffee shop, and the man who interviewed you was very precise and warm and said, "Bring nothing you are not comfortable leaving behind." Please look at the guidelines carefully. Every rule is there for a reason. Follow them. Stay in the chair.